Saint Margaret of Scotland, born around 1045, 1050, was revered as and called the Pearl of Scotland. Wonderful saint. She was a mother and she was a noblewoman. And very holy, very similar to Elizabeth of Hungary. And so today we celebrate Saint Margaret of Scotland, born in Hungary, to English Prince Edward the Exile and Agatha. And she descended from the Anglo-Saxon lineage, including great uncle Saint Edward the Confessor. So she had famous grandparents and came from a famous lineage. So noble princess, Margaret of Scotland, well known in the 11th century, and she lived to be about 50. So she didn't live to her old age, but she in her life was so, she lived a life of piety, even though she, like Elizabeth of Hungary, was a noblewoman and was treated as such. She was educated in the faith and learned. She was also exiled. Margaret cherished scripture and aspired to even be a sister. She didn't want to get married, but she was betrothed and kind of in an arranged marriage. Later on, there was a big invasion. William the Conqueror came in around 1066 something and forced them to flee north. And so tradition tells us that there was a shipwreck. And out on Scotland's coast, a big storm, around the 1070s. She was educated in the faith. During an exile, she and her family, she cherished scripture and aspired to be a nun. But her family returned to England in the 1060s, and William the Conqueror invaded, and that forced them to flee north. So there was a big storm, there was a shipwreck on Scotland's coast, and landing at what became St. Margaret's Hope, King Malcolm, at the time, of Canmore, was kind of a rough warrior-type widower, offered refuge and soon sought her hand. So she wasn't planning on getting married, but King William, was smitten by her. She was a pious woman. And so initially she was reluctant, but she eventually did marry Malcolm and King Malcolm in 1070. She was about 25 years old, and their marriage actually converted him, transformed him until, he was this illiterate warrior king, and he wound up adoring her piety and often kissing her, seeing how she kissed the gospel books and adoring them with gold, in a sense, more than jewels. She read scripture out loud, and it would soften his temper. So he was moved by her devotion and her piety, her faith modeled to him, something different that he never had seen. So she kind of, that rubbed off on him pretty well. So they had 8 children together, 6 boys and 2 girls, and they were raised in the Catholic faith. There was also, as queen, Margaret civilized the court with, she brought in civility, promoted the arts and education. She was into embroidery, very similar to Elizabeth of Hungary. I think Elizabeth of Hungary was probably, because she was later during the 1200s, inspired by Saint Margaret of Scotland, because their lives were very, very similar. Their sainthood and everything. Like Elizabeth of Hungary, Margaret, she built workshops for embroidery for church vestments. So she was known, her piety spilled out into creating, investments like this. This came from Poland. Now, this was machine-made, but it was also hand-put together. And back then, when they didn't have machines, they had to do everything by hand, meticulously. So embroidery was a type of service and a type of you could make a living doing it if you were really talented. And so she attended Mass often. She fasted. She was very rigorous during Lent and Advent, and she publicly was so. And she very much entertained, priests and bishops because of her status. She was well connected, networked in the church, and she was just a huge figure in the 11th century. She did a lot of works of charity, of course, with the treasury. She had access to funds, and she was even reported in record of washing the poor's feet, like, Jesus washing the feet of the apostles. She served hundreds in soup kitchens and infirmaries, etc. She just was constantly in service. And that's still part of, if you're part of the Roman, if you're part of nobility in any sense, especially in England, part of the royal duties was to do charitable works. And you see that even nowadays. But it's always been the tradition for, centuries and centuries. She took care of the sick. She built hospitals and housing, free ferries from Queensbury for pilgrims to go up north to St. Andrews and so forth. So she was very well connected. This was at the high, medieval ages, 11th century. She restored an abbey. Legend has it, actually historically it's been recorded, Iona's Abbey. And so it was a Benedictine monastery, I believe. And she erected churches, and including St. Margaret's Chapel in Edinburgh, and so which is one of Scotland's oldest buildings. In 1093, she lost her husband and one of her sons, Edward. They fell in battle at against the Normans. I don't know, the Vikings, the Normans in that time was battling pretty at its height during this 11th century. So the Vikings were coming down, and the Saxons were always battling the Normans, those from Normandy. And then she died later too. She suffered at Edinburgh Castle. She died, and she was buried. Her tomb is still there, and it was associated with healing miracles, drawing lots of pilgrims. She set the standard for charitable works for the royalty, princes and princesses, and those of the court. She really was a big figure during that time, and was well respected for still to this day. So 1,000 years later, she's still a huge figure, Margaret of Scotland. She was canonized in 1250, so about 150 years later, at the same time as Elizabeth of Hungary. Pope Innocent IV canonized Margaret of Scotland, and she's the patron along with St. Andrew. So she is the secondary patron, but she is connected to Andrew and Scotland, the north. And her feast shifted from June 10th to November 16th, after Vatican II changed the calendar around a bit. She's well venerated in both the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church, and she's the patroness of Scotland, large families, queens, widows, and bereaved parents who've lost children. She lost children too. She's also, she's a patroness of learning, school, the poor, and she basically could, prove by her example that you can live both. You can live a life of nobility and royal duty, and piety and duty to prayer and church.